There was a time when Chris Redfield and Leon Kennedy were Resident Evil. Two faces of the same war, one forged in a field, the other hardened by loss. Chris was a soldier, built from duty and discipline. Leon was the survivor, built from chaos and consequence. Different men, different paths, but both kind of carved from the same era. An era where horror wore a human face and the heroes were just strong enough to stand against it. That era's gone now. The world of Resident Evil doesn't need saviors anymore. It doesn't need BSAA captains or government agents. It needs victims, people who can break, people who run, people who feel the fear again. And in a strange way, both Chris and Leon have both become obstacles to that fear. Not villains, not failures, just remnants. Fragments of a time when the series thought action was the cure for horror. Chris Redfield spent his life fighting the same war long after the world stopped asking for soldiers. He's the last believer in a crusade against bioweapons, a man so consumed by a mission that he's become inseparable from it. Every outbreak, every tragedy, and still he marches forward, a living symbol of the franchise's old heartbeat. Leon, on the other hand, wears his survival like a curse. Every tragedy has carved something out of him. Raccoon City, Spain, the government's endless lies. He's tired, broken in ways he doesn't talk about. And yet the games keep dragging him back into the same loop of duty and despair. He isn't fighting for justice anymore, he's fighting because he doesn't know how to stop. They are two relics of two different eras. Chris, the soldier who refuses to die, and Leon, the hero who can't live. Both trapped in a cycle that no longer fits the story around them. Capcom has rebuilt Resident Evil into something more intimate, more human. But the old guards still linger like ghosts in the machine. Maybe that's actually the real horror now, watching two men who once defined this world slowly become strangers in it. The action hero and the tragic survivor, standing on the opposite ends of a franchise that has finally learned to breathe without him. Sooner or later, every legend outlives its purpose, and for Chris and Leon, that moment may already be here. Before Resident Evil became a ghost story about families, cults, and the fear of isolation, it was a war story. One fought in laboratories, alleyways, and burning cities. And at the center of the war, there were two men who embodied everything the series once stood for. Chris Redfield and Leon S. Kennedy. Different temperaments, same mission. Survive, save, repeat. Chris was the franchise's first soldier. When we met him in the Spencer mansion, he wasn't superhuman, just a man with a gun and a duty. He kicked open doors, rationed bullets, and carried the weight of every partner he couldn't save. He was the blueprint for Resident Evil's brand of strength. Calm under pressure, pragmatic, a little reckless, but always human. Over the years, though, that humanity was reforged into something else. By the time we reached Resident Evil 5 and 6, Chris wasn't just fighting monsters anymore, he was one. At least in spirit. Veins bulging, shirt sleeves shredded, fists colliding with boulders and volcanic infernos. It was absurd, but it worked. Because the world wanted heroes who could win. The fear didn't come from helplessness anymore, it came from escalation. And Chris was built to win that kind of war. Leon's rise was a bit different. If Chris was a soldier, Leon was the everyman turned myth. The rookie cop who walked into hell on his first day. In Resident Evil 2, Leon wasn't even a warrior, he was a survivor. He stumbled through Raccoon City wide-eyed and terrified, but his compassion and determination made him the perfect audience surrogate. Then Resident Evil 4 changed everything. Leon traded in how naive he was for roundhouse kicks, one-liners, and an arsenal fit for a B-movie god. The scared rookie had evolved into the perfect action hero, cool, confident, cinematic. And at the time, that's exactly what Capcom needed. Because the series itself was changing. The early 2000s wasn't an age of quiet fear, it was an era of spectacle. Games wanted to look like Hollywood and sound like war. Resident Evil followed suit, and Chris and Leon became its twin poster boys of success. One fought armies of infected mercenaries under the African sun, the other fought medieval cults while cracking jokes through gunsmoke. They weren't horror icons anymore, they were blockbuster icons. The old mansion doors creaked open, but instead of dread waiting on the other side, it was a quick-time event and an explosion. And for a while, that was fine. it worked. Resident Evil didn't just survive its own identity crisis, it thrived on it. Chris and Leon were symbols of Capcom's confidence. This was proof that the franchise could stand toe-to-toe with Call of Duty and Gears of War without losing its edge. But when the dust settled, something was missing. That slow, suffocating sense of dread. That smallness. That feeling that the walls were closing in and no one, not even a soldier, could save you. Chris and Leon had saved Resident Evil from irrelevance. They turned it into a global spectacle. But in doing so, they built a world where fear had no place left to hide. And when Resident Evil 7 came along years later, that world, the one they helped shape, was quietly buried under the floorboards. Because horror, true horror, doesn't need heroes, it needs victims. And Chris Redfield and Leon Kennedy had become anything but. When Resident Evil 7 released, it didn't just reboot the franchise, it rewrote its DNA. When Resident Evil 7 released, it didn't just reboot the franchise, it rewrote its DNA. Gone were the cityscapes, the military command centers, the countless exposition dumps written on notepads, and the endless talk of bioweapons and conspiracies. In their place stood a rotting house in the middle of Louisiana, a single terrified man and the sound of floorboards groaning under invisible footsteps. For the first time in years, Resident Evil remembered what fear actually felt like. It wasn't about surviving the apocalypse anymore, it was about surviving the night. That shift created a strange tension within the series' own universe. Because somewhere out there, Chris Redfield and Leon Kennedy still existed. They were still trained, still active, still canon. Yet when you step into the shoes of Ethan Winters, you can feel an absence of those larger-than-life heroes. Ethan doesn't fight, he flails. He doesn't aim perfectly, he panics. He's not a soldier or an agent, he's just a person. And that was the point. For the first time since the 1990s, Resident Evil was willing to make the player feel powerless again. And in that vulnerability, the franchise rediscovered itself. The idea of the player as a superhuman savior was gone. Instead, fear returned in its purest form, through uncertainty, through helplessness, through the knowledge that you weren't built to survive what was coming. When Chris finally appeared at the end of Resident Evil 7, it felt wrong. Not because he didn't belong in the lore, but because he didn't belong in the tone. You spend hours wandering in horror, fighting for your life with scraps and broken weapons. Then suddenly, the man who once wrestled monsters barehanded steps out of a helicopter with military gear and perfect aim. The atmosphere collapses, the dread dissipates, the camera no longer trembles, it salutes. Chris Redfield enters the frame, and horror leaves the room. Leon's absence, on the other hand, speaks louder than his presence. By Resident Evil 7 and Village, he's become a ghost, mentioned, remembered, but never seen. And that silence says everything. Capcom seems to know that Leon's brand of cool heroism doesn't fit anymore. The one-liners, the smirks, the perfectly aimed headshots, they shatter the illusion of fear that the modern games fought so hard to build. If Chris breaks horror through intrusion, Leon breaks it through tone. One is too physical for this new world, the other's too self-aware. Both of them are survivors of a story that no longer wants them in it. Resident Evil 7 and Village built a smaller, more personal universe. There are no global stakes, there are no more nuclear crises or secret task forces spanning continents. Instead, the horror has turned inward. It's about haunted homes, cursed families, and the sins that rot beneath domestic life. That's not a world for soldiers and agents, that's a world for people who bleed and break and cry. And that's the paradox Capcom faces. The franchise rebuilt itself by tearing down everything that once defined it. It rediscovered fear by killing off spectacle. But Chris Redfield and Leon Kennedy, the twin pillars that held up the old spectacle upright, still linger in the canon like shadows of a war long ended. Now whenever Chris shows up, the camera feels heavier, slower, more reluctant, as if even the story doesn't quite know how to hold him anymore. He's the symbol of a universe that has outgrown its own heroes. Leon, meanwhile, remains frozen in the past, reanimated only for remakes, safe within nostalgia, never allowed to truly exist in the present. It's not that the world forgot them. Trust me, it's definitely not. It's that the world moved on. And maybe in its own quiet way, Resident Evil is trying to tell us the true horror now isn't infection, mutation, or death. It's watching the people who once saved us become strangers in the story they built. Don't let the tone fool you. I love Chris and Leon. Not just as characters, but as cornerstones of Resident Evil's identity. They're icons. They're two men who carried the franchise through its wildest transformations, and we've seen a lot, from fixed camera angle nightmares to full-blown cinematic chaos. They aren't just survivors in the story, they're survivors of the story, of every reboot, retcon, every reinvention Capcom ever threw at them. And that's why this conversation hurts a bit, because when you truly admire what they've become, you can't help but see the tragedy of what they're forced to be now. Chris is the definition of loyalty. He's the last soldier standing, the moral constant in a world that's rewritten its rules a dozen times over, Capcom. He's fought, lost, rebuilt, and kept going even when the mission stopped making sense. He's not just a hero, he's a monument to endurance, and maybe that's his curse. Chris doesn't know when to stop. The world around him keeps changing, the threats, the tone, the genre itself, but he's fighting the same war. He's still chasing bioweapons and phantom corporations as if he's activated by muscle memory or something. The unwavering resolve, once his greatest strength, now makes him feel displaced in a story that rediscovered fear. In Resident Evil Village, when Chris finally steps into view, I felt that familiar urge of comfort. The protector, the professional, the guy that fixes it all, the hero of the story. That comfort is exactly what breaks the spell, because Chris brings safety into a world built on dread. When he enters the frame, the fear changes shape. It becomes external, tactical, logical even. You stop feeling scared with him and start feeling safe because of him. As much as I love seeing him there, part of me realizes the story doesn't know what to do with him anymore. He's too dependable for a series that's finally comfortable with chaos. Leon Kennedy, though? Leon is something else entirely. He's not duty-bound like Chris, he's emotionally anchored. He's a rookie who walked into hell and came out changed, scarred, and endlessly human. Leon has always been the beating heart of Resident Evil's emotional core. Even in its most cinematic, over-the-top moments, the suplexes and one-liners, there's pain beneath it. A man who saw too much too soon learned to smile through the trauma. He's tragedy built in charm. But Leon's struggle is internal. He's the face of the franchise's most beloved era, stylish, confident, heroic, and that's a double-edged sword now. Those qualities made him iconic, but they also made him incompatible with modern horror. In Resident Evil 4's remake, Capcom beautifully tries to humanize him again. You see the cracks, the exhaustion, the weight of his past pressing him down. And yet, even broken, Leon remains too compressed for the kind of fear Resident Evil now trades in. The moment he steps into a room, dread becomes admiration. You don't fear for him, you root with him. And that subtle difference is what keeps him from fully fitting into the new world Capcom is building. But make no mistake, it isn't their fault. If anything, it's proof of how perfectly Chris and Leon embody eras they came from. Chris represents Resident Evil's spine, the physical, relentless pursuit of justice. Leon represents the soul, the emotional, haunted weight of survival. And they both have earned the right to be here. They deserve reverence, not replacement. But still, Resident Evil has changed. It's smaller now, intimate, vulnerable even. It's about ordinary people cracking under extraordinary circumstances, and when you introduce living legends like Chris and Leon into that framework, they overpower the silence. Their very presence reminds you that everything in a series was once heroic, global, and loud. And that's everything it's trying not to be anymore. That's the paradox. Chris and Leon aren't problems because they're outdated. They're problems because they're perfect for a version of Resident Evil that no longer exists. They're too strong, too defined, too complete. And when your heroes are already legends, there's nowhere left for them to go except in circles. I don't want them written out. I don't want them forgotten either. I just want them to find peace, a conclusion worthy of decades they've carried this series on their backs. They don't deserve to fade quietly into the night. They deserve to rest knowing they saved the world, and maybe in their own way saved Resident Evil itself. There's a kind of sadness in watching legends outlive their era. Chris Redfield and Leon Kennedy were once the sharp edge of Resident Evil's evolution, but now they stand as echoes of two philosophies that the series has left behind. And it's not because they've lost their power. It's because the world around them has changed into something their power can't reach. Chris Redfield is a soldier in a world that doesn't need soldiers anymore. He's the last believer in a war that's already been won, or maybe one that can never really be won at all. He's seen so much death that his victories don't even look like triumphs anymore. They look like survival. And in that survival, there's a quiet tragedy. Chris doesn't know who he is without the mission. Every time the world stops burning, he finds a new fire to walk into. He trains the next generation, builds new organizations, hunts down remnants of the old Umbrella. But what he's really fighting is stillness. Because if the war ends, what does a soldier like him become? There's a moment in Resident Evil Village that captures this perfectly. Chris moves through the dark, tactical, efficient, every motion precise, every word controlled. He's the embodiment of discipline. But there's something hollow behind his eyes. He isn't fighting out of hope anymore, he's fighting because he doesn't know how to stop. In another story, this would make him a tragic hero. Here, it kind of just makes him a ghost. A man existing out of obligation, haunting the series that made him. He's not out of place because he's outdated. He's out of place because the world stopped needing someone so relentlessly capable. Leon, by contrast, isn't a soldier. He is a survivor, cursed to remember. Every mission, every loss, every scream in the dark has left a mark that he can't wash away. He's carried his trauma like a quiet companion since Raccoon City. And with every reappearance, he looks a little more tired. Not weaker, not broken, but haunted. Where Chris fights to keep the mission alive, Leon fights to convince himself that the mission means anything at all. He's seen the system rot from the inside, seen the government twist morality until right becomes wrong, and everything becomes meaningless. And yet he keeps going because stopping would mean facing the emptiness he's been avoiding for years. Leon is the embodiment of a specific kind of heroism, one that refuses to die even when it knows the world doesn't deserve saving. That's what makes him beautiful but also tragic. Every time he returns, there's less of that cocky charm, less of that fire, and more of a man going through the motions because he can't find another way to live. He's the reflection of what happens when survival becomes identity. The hero who can't move forward because he's defined entirely by what he's endured. Chris and Leon are two sides of the same coin, the soldier and the survivor. One fights because he can't rest, and the other one lives because he can't quit. And both are trapped in a universe that's moved beyond the need for their kind of heroism. In the modern Resident Evil, the fear comes from fragility, from human weakness, from the unknown. And Chris and Leon are the exact opposite of that. They're certainty, they're control. They're what happens when experience replaces fear. And no matter how much a series evolves, their existence forces it to look backwards, towards a time when monsters were big and heroes were larger and the story was simpler. But here's the irony. They're not relics because they failed. They're relics because they succeeded. They won the fight. They outlasted the nightmare, they became legends, and now the world of Resident Evil is finally at peace. Just not the kind of peace that has a place for them. And so they linger, like men out of time. Chris forever chasing the next ghost of Umbrella, Leon forever chasing redemption he'll never truly find. Each haunted in his own way by the same quiet truth. They've already done their part. And the longer they stay, the more the world will start to forget why they even needed them in the first place. They deserve something better than to fade quietly into side missions and cameo appearances. They deserve an ending worthy of their legend, one that doesn't erase them but honors them. Because they aren't just characters in a horror franchise, they're the reason Resident Evil survived long enough to rediscover the same fear you see today. And maybe that's the cruelest twist of all, that the very men who saved horror were never meant to live in it forever. Despite everything, despite the shifts in tone and the changing of eras and the new faces and the new fears, fans still want to see them. Chris Redfield and Leon Kennedy, the twin anchors of the franchise that span for generations. When the rumors about Resident Evil Requiem started circulating, you could feel the collective heartbeat of the fanbase skip. Because even after all this time, the idea of Chris and Leon standing shoulder to shoulder again still means something. A hope that maybe one more story could finally give them the send-off they deserve, or even just remind us of why we fell in love with them in the first place. It's not just nostalgia, it's connection. It's knowing that these two men carried Resident Evil through its loudest, darkest, and most uncertain years. When the series lost itself to spectacle, they were still there and they still showed up. We might argue about tone, gameplay, and direction, but almost everyone, no matter what era they started in, has a memory tied to Chris or Leon. For some, it's the Spencer Mansion. For others, it's the streets of Raccoon City. For many, it's the rural village in Spain or a volcano at the end of the world. That's why this question matters now. Should Requiem bring them back, or is it time to finally let them rest? Because if Resident Evil Requiem really is the series' next great turning point, then Capcom has a choice to make. There's a question hanging over Resident Evil Requiem one that every fan seems to be asking, even if they didn't say it outright. Should Chris or Leon come back? Should they make a cameo? Should they appear? It's a tempting thought. The two of them together again, the soldier and the survivor, united one last time in a world that's moved on without them. For years we've watched Resident Evil change shape, rediscover horror, reimagine itself, and rebuild the fear that made it legendary in the first place. But through every reinvention, there's always been a part of us waiting, hoping, for one more chapter with the men who built it. Because seeing Chris and Leon again would feel like the universe coming full circle. A reunion not just of characters, but of eras. The old world meeting the new. But here's the hard truth. Sometimes bringing legends back too soon can cheapen the legacy. And right now, Resident Evil finally feels like it knows what it wants to be again. It's smaller, quieter, more personal, built on dread and vulnerability instead of heroics and explosions. And dropping Chris and Leon into that framework right now would tip the balance back towards familiarity. It would remind us of that action, the bravado, and the spectacle, all the things Capcom spent years unlearning. They'd steal the spotlight by simply existing. And that's not their fault. It's the weight of who they are. Symbols too powerful for subtlety. Heroes too defined to be uncertain. The kind of presence that dominates a scene before they can even speak. If Requiem really is about evolution, about cementing this new phase of Resident Evil, then it needs to breathe without them. In my opinion, it needs to stand on its own, without the ghost of its greatest heroes kind of just standing in the doorway watching. But yeah, they should return. Someday they should. Not as nostalgia bait or cameo characters, though, but as the heart of a story that finally closes the book. Chris and Leon at least deserve that. They deserve a true ending, one that honors the decades they've carried the franchise on their backs. An ending that doesn't kill them for shock value or leave them forgotten in side missions, but one that recognizes their humanity, their cost of survival, the weight of their memory, the ache of never being allowed to stop. Requiem could be many things, but right now, it shouldn't be their story. Not yet. Because for the first time in years, the world feels new again, uncharted, raw, and fragile. And sometimes the best way to honor the past is to let the present grow without it. Still, one day, when this new era has found its full voice, when the story has earned the right to look back, then yes, let them return. Let them walk out into the sunset, not as soldiers or survivors, but as two men who finally get to stop running. Because Chris and Leon don't deserve another mission, they deserve peace. An ending. A true requiem.